Joy Behar insults. Karoline on The View. Studio audience extremely outraged. Demand ban. The studio lights blazed down the air, thick with the electric tension of a live broadcast. The audience hushed as the camera panned across the polished set, finally locking onto the sharply dressed, unflinching figure of Karoline Leavitt. She sat in the guest chair, her back straight eyes steady, the faintest hint of a confident smile playing at her lips. Across from her, Joy Behar adjusted her notes, her jaw set, eyes sharp, ready for the verbal sparring match that had drawn viewers from coast to coast. This wasn't just an interview, it was a battleground. So, Karoline, Joy began, her voice dripping with the practiced condescension of a seasoned pundit. What's it like being the youngest press secretary in White House history, I mean? Is it all just a bit too much for you? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The audience leaned in, sensing the crackle of a coming storm. Karoline's smile didn't falter. She met Joy's gaze without blinking. "Well, Joy," she replied, her voice smooth but edged with steel, "I guess that depends on what you mean by too much. If you're asking whether I'm overwhelmed by the weight of my responsibilities, the answer is no. If you're asking whether I'm surprised by the pushback from people who underestimated me also, I'm quite used to it." Joy's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. She wasn't used to guests hitting back so quickly. Alyssa Farah Griffin, seated a few chairs down, glanced sideways, sensing the tension rising. "Oh, come on!" Joy shot back, leaning forward. "You can't deny that your appointment raised a few eyebrows. I mean, no one really knew who you were until Trump plucked you from obscurity. Do you really think you're qualified to speak for the entire country?" Karoline leaned in, mirroring Joy's posture. "I find it interesting, Joy, that you assume youth equals inexperience. I've worked in the trenches, not just in front of the cameras. I've been on Capitol Hill, I've been in the White House, and yes, I've taken the heat from people like you before. You see, I didn't get here by being quiet, and I'm certainly not going to start now." A ripple of murmurs swept through the studio audience. Karoline's tone, calm but cutting, sliced through the polite veneer of daytime television like a blade. Joy's jaw tightened, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her note cards. "All right," Joy shot back, her voice rising a notch, "but let's be real. You're here because of Trump. Without him, you'd just be another ambitious young staffer lost in the shuffle. Do you really believe you're here on merit?" Karoline's smile turned into a cool, dangerous grin. "Merit, Joy, I've earned my seat at this table the same way you earned yours, by speaking my mind and refusing to back down even when the odds were against me. I'm here because I fight for what I believe in, not because I played it safe or stuck to the script." Alyssa, sensing an opportunity to break the mounting tension, leaned in. "But Carolina," she said carefully, "don't you think being so closely tied to Trump limits your credibility with the broader American public? I mean, don't you worry about being seen as just another loyal soldier in his camp?" Caroline's eyes flicked to Alyssa, her expression unchanging. "Loyalty is only a liability if you stand for nothing. I stand for transparency, for strength, and for truth. And if that aligns me with a president who puts America first, so be it." The audience, sensing the growing heat, began to stir, a few scattered claps breaking through the tense silence. Joy, unwilling to let her grip on the conversation slip, pressed on. "You keep talking about transparency," she snapped, her tone sharp as broken glass. "But what about the scandals, the chaos, the lies? How can you stand there and act like this administration is a beacon of truth?" Karoline's smile vanished, her eyes turning to icy slits. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Joy, if you want to talk about lies, I suggest we broaden the conversation, because the media has had its fair share of moments where the truth took a backseat to agenda. If we're going to talk about transparency, let's be honest about who's really shaping the narrative in this country." The room fell into a heavy silence, the air crackling with the unspoken challenge. Joy opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden turn in the conversation. Alyssa glanced at the camera, her eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. For a moment, the studio felt like a pressure cooker, the tension building, begging for release, and Karoline, sensing the shift, leaned back, her confident smile returning as the camera light blinks red, signaling a commercial break. "Well," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Joy's, "this is just getting interesting." The studio lights blazed down, reflecting sharply off the polished wood of the stage. The audience, a mix of curious onlookers and die-hard fans, leaned forward, their anticipation palpable. Karoline adjusted her mic, her fingers brushing the cool metal, her eyes fixed on the panel across from her. The energy in the room crackled, a silent promise of the clash to come. Joy Behar leaned in, her fingers steepled, a slight smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She had been in this chair for decades, her voice a staple of daytime television, her opinions as sharp as the studio's stage lights. She wasted no time. Karoline Joy began, her tone dripping with the practiced patience of someone ready to strike. You've become quite the star lately. Young, bold, and unapologetically loyal to Trump. But don't you think that loyalty blinds you to the real world? The audience stirred, a few whispers cutting through the otherwise tense silence. Carolina met Joy's gaze without flinching. She had prepared for this. Respectfully, Joy Karoline replied, her voice clear and firm. I'm here because I believe in something bigger than myself. I'm not playing a role for ratings. I'm standing up for a movement that represents millions of Americans who feel silenced and ignored. Joy's smile tightened. She could feel the challenge in Karoline's tone, the fire behind her words. She leaned back, folding her arms, eyes narrowing. Oh, you're standing up for the people. Joy shot back, her voice rising slightly, a hint of mockery slipping through. Or are you just standing up for a man who can't stand up for himself without a swarm of loyalists shouting into microphones on his behalf? The crowd let out a collective gasp, a sharp intake of breath that filled the studio with a sudden electric tension. Karoline's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. She leaned in, matching Joy's intensity. I'm standing up for what I believe is right. Karoline shot back, her eyes locking with Joy's. And I don't back down just because someone on a TV stage tries to frame my beliefs as blind loyalty. Alyssa Farah Griffin, sitting to Joy's left, shifted in her chair. She had once been on Karoline's side, part of the same political machine, but now found herself on the opposite end of the ideological spectrum. She cut in, her tone sharp, her eyes narrowing. Karoline, you talk about standing up for what you believe in, but do you ever stop to consider the cost? The damage this blind loyalty is doing to the country. Karoline's gaze flicked to Alyssa, her lips tightening into a thin line. Blind loyalty, she echoed, her voice growing colder. You mean the kind of loyalty that kept this country strong for generations? The kind of loyalty that stands up to the media's constant attacks and the political elite's hypocrisy. The audience murmured, a few claps echoing from the back rows. Joy's eyes flashed, and she leaned in, her voice dripping with disdain. Oh, please spare me the Patriot Act. Joy spat, her hands gripping the edge of the table. You're just a mouthpiece. A pretty face thrown in front of cameras to distract from the chaos behind the scenes. Karoline felt the heat rising in her chest, a slow, steady burn that threatened to crack her calm exterior. She straightened her shoulders, squaring, her eyes hardening as she leaned into the microphone. If standing up for my beliefs makes me a mouthpiece, she shot back, her voice steady but sharp, then I'll proudly be the loudest one in the room. Because at least I'm fighting for something. At least I'm not sitting on this stage hiding behind a legacy of cheap shots and lazy commentary. The audience erupted, a mix of gasps and scattered applause. Joy's face darkened, her jaw clenching as she opened her mouth to retort, but Karoline pushed on, her voice cutting through the noise. You want to talk about chaos? Fine. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about a media machine that profits off division, that sells outrage like a cheap tabloid, that turns real issues into clickbait and sound bites. Joy's eyes blazed, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the table. Alyssa's eyes darted between the two women, her own face a mask of unease. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point, the air thick with the weight of unspoken challenges and years of political friction. The camera crew exchanged glances, their lenses zooming in, capturing every flicker of emotion, every tightened jaw, every flash of anger. This was the moment they had hoped for, raw, unfiltered confrontation. Joy leaned in again, her voice low but cutting. You think you can walk in here, spout a few rehearsed lines, and leave unscathed? This isn't a campaign rally, Karoline. This is real life. And in the real world, blind loyalty will get you nowhere. Karoline's eyes narrowed, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the pressure, the weight of the spotlight, the eyes of millions watching. But she refused to back down. She straightened, her voice clear and strong as she delivered her final line. I'm not here to leave unscathed, Joy. I'm here to win. The audience erupted the studio, filled with a chaotic mix of cheers, jeers, and the sharp clap of hands. The stage lights seemed to burn a little brighter, the camera zooming in, capturing the intensity of the moment. As the echoes of the clash reverberated through the studio, the stakes had never been higher. Karoline knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew she had just taken the first crucial step in a battle that would define her career. The studio lights flared back to life, casting sharp shadows across the polished floors as the second segment of the show resumed. Karoline Leavitt sat tall in her chair, her gaze unflinching, as the hosts of The View leaned in their expressions a mix of curiosity, frustration, and barely concealed disdain. The audience, now fully drawn into the unfolding drama, held their breath, sensing the storm that was about to break. Joy Behar, her brow furrowed, was the first to speak. She leaned forward, her glasses catching the light. "So, Karoline, let's talk about your recent comments. You said that the media is intentionally misleading the public, creating a false narrative to control people's perceptions. That's a pretty bold claim, even for someone in your position." Karoline's lips curved into a thin, knowing smile. She met Joy's gaze without flinching. "Bold, yes, but that doesn't make it any less true." Alyssa Farah Griffin, seated to Joy's right, folded her arms, her expression skeptical. "But you're part of the media now, Karoline. You're the White House press secretary. Isn't it a bit hypocritical to attack the very institution you're part of?" Karoline chuckled softly, the sound slicing through the tension like a blade. "There's a difference, Alyssa. I don't see my role as spinning narratives or manipulating the truth. I'm here to inform the public, not to push an agenda." Joy scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, come on! Every administration has an agenda. Don't play coy." Karoline's eyes hardened, her smile fading. "No, Joy. There's a difference between having principles and manipulating facts to fit a narrative. I respect the truth. I respect the American people. I'm not here to mislead them." Sunny Hostin, who had remained silent until now, leaned in, her tone sharp. "So, are you saying the rest of us here don't respect the truth? That we're just puppets for some hidden agenda?" Karoline's gaze didn't waver. "I'm saying that too many in the media are more concerned with crafting a story than reporting the facts. And if the shoe fits, Sunny, maybe it's time to do some self-reflection." The audience murmured a few scattered claps, breaking the heavy silence. The camera swung between the hosts, capturing the tightening of their jaws, the narrowing of their eyes. Joy cut in again, her voice rising. "You talk a big game about the truth, but let's not pretend you don't have your own biases. You worked for Trump. You're his mouthpiece. How is that any different from the media figures you're attacking?" Karoline's jaw tightened, her eyes blazing. She leaned forward, her voice low but seething with controlled fury. "The difference, Joy, is that I don't hide my intentions. I am upfront about where I stand, and I don't pretend to be an impartial observer while pushing a political agenda." Alyssa's eyes narrowed. "But isn't that exactly what you're doing?" Just from the other side, Karoline shook her head, her voice growing colder. "No, I am transparent. I am accountable. I don't hide behind anonymous sources and vague implications. I stand by my words even when it's uncomfortable." Sunny leaned in further, her fingers tapping the table in irritation. "You act like you're some kind of martyr for truth, but you're just as political as the rest of us. Maybe even more so because you're actively shaping the narrative from the most powerful podium in the world." Karoline's eyes flashed. She felt the heat of the lights, the weight of the cameras, the eyes of millions watching this exchange. She refused to back down. "You're right about one thing, Sunny. I am shaping the narrative. I'm shaping it back to the truth, to accountability, to honesty. That's my job, and I refuse to apologize for it." The audience erupted into a mix of claps and murmurs. A few shots rang out from the back, a chaotic blend of support and dissent that mirrored the division on the stage. The hosts glanced at each other, their carefully coordinated facade beginning to crack. Joy leaned in, her voice a sharp blade. "You think you're some kind of truth teller, but you're just another political operative with a polished smile. Spare us the martyr complex." Karoline's eyes narrowed, her grip on the edge of the table, tightening. "You can call me whatever you want, Joy, but the difference between us is clear. I'm not afraid to speak the truth even when it's unpopular. I don't hide behind groupthink. I don't bow to the pressure of the mob." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Karoline cut her off, her voice rising above the building din of the audience. You want to talk about the truth? Let's talk about the selective outrage, the manufactured narratives, the twisting of facts to fit a political agenda. Let's talk about how you preach tolerance and inclusivity but turn vicious the moment someone challenges your worldview. The air in the studio felt electric, the tension so thick it seemed to warp the very air. The camera zoomed in, catching every flash of anger, every tightening of fists. The hosts exchanged quick, uncertain glances, sensing that this conversation had veered far off the predictable script. As the segment wound down the stage, lights dimming slightly, Karoline leaned back, a small, defiant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had walked into their arena, faced their pointed questions and veiled barbs, and held her ground. But she knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was still to come. The studio lights blazed hotter than ever as the camera zoomed in on Karoline's face. The air crackled with the charged tension of a confrontation about to reach its peak. The View's audience leaned forward, eyes wide, breaths held, sensing that the polite pretense of civil debate had just shattered. Joy leaned back, her arms crossed, a smug, almost satisfied grin spreading across her face. She had pushed Karoline to this moment, the brink where the younger woman would either crumble or explode. It was a test of endurance, a trial by fire. "Tell me," Karoline, Joy said, her voice dripping with mock concern. "How does it feel to be a mouthpiece for a man who has openly attacked the very foundations of our democracy, to be the polished, pretty face of a movement that many would argue has set this country back decades?" Karoline's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. She could feel the eyes of the audience, the heat of the studio lights, the weight of 1,000 judgmental tweets forming in real time. But she refused to back down. She leaned in, her eyes locking onto Joy's with a fierce, unblinking intensity. "You want to talk about setting the country back?" Joy Karoline shot back, her voice low but cutting. "You sit there on your throne of moral superiority, passing judgment on people like me, young women who dare to step into the arena you claim to have paved the way for. You preach about feminism and empowerment, but the moment a woman stands for something you don't agree with, you try to tear her down." The crowd let out a collective sharp inhale, the kind of breathless anticipation that only comes when the air is thick with conflict. Alyssa Farrah Griffin shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing the storm building between her co-hosts. Sunny Hostin, eyes narrowed, leaned in slightly, prepared to jump in if needed, but for now she chose to watch, her lips pursed tightly. Joy's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something sharp and dangerous flashing in her eyes. But she quickly recovered, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension only years of on-air combat can perfect. "Oh, honey," Joy cooed, leaning forward, her hands folding neatly on the table. "I've seen young firebrands like you come and go, full of passion, full of righteousness, convinced they're on the right side of history, until the reality of the world crashes down around them. Tell me, how's it going? Being the brave face of a man whose legacy is built on division and scandal." Karoline's eyes flashed a spark, igniting behind them. She leaned in closer, her voice sharp and precise, cutting through Joy's taunts like a blade. "You mean the man who actually gave a voice to millions of Americans who felt abandoned by the establishment? The man who didn't just talk about change, but actually delivered it while you sat behind this desk, sneering at anyone who dared to challenge the status quo?" The audience murmured a low rumble of conflicting whispers that filled the gaps in the silence. Joy's jaw tightened, the mask slipping for just a moment as the camera caught the subtle twitch in her clenched fingers. Alyssa finally interjected, her tone sharp, her eyes flicking between the two women. "Ladies, maybe we should dial this back a bit. We're here to discuss ideas, not just tear each other down." Joy waved a dismissive hand, her eyes never leaving Karoline's. "Oh, I'm just trying to understand where she gets this unshakable faith in a man who has lied, cheated, and divided this country more than any other in recent memory." Karoline straightened her spine like a steel rod, her voice steady and unyielding. "You talk about lies and division, Joy, but let's not pretend you and this show have been innocent bystanders. You push narratives that fit your worldview, attack anyone who dares to disagree, and then act shocked when people push back. You helped create this environment." The room fell silent, the tension so thick it seemed to press down on everyone in the studio. Even the producers, normally bustling around behind the cameras, paused, their eyes locked on the unfolding verbal duel. Joy leaned back, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the tabletop, her eyes narrowing. So you're saying it's our fault that people like me who actually care about this country, who want to see it move forward, are to blame for the mess we're in? Karoline's lips curled into a tight, challenging smile. I'm saying that you've become the very thing you claim to stand against, an elitist out of touch with the very people you claim to defend. The silence that followed felt like a held breath, a moment stretched to the breaking point, each woman staring the other down, neither willing to blink, neither willing to concede even an inch. And in that silence, the battle lines became clearer than ever. It wasn't just a debate, it was a war, a clash of ideals, of generations of visions for the country's future. Joy's eyes darkened, her jaw setting as she prepared to fire back. But for the first time in a long time, she hesitated, the words catching in her throat, the carefully rehearsed defenses crumbling under the intensity of Karoline's unflinching gaze. The studio lights blazed hotter than ever as Karoline Leavitt leaned into the microphone, her eyes fixed on Joy Behar across the table. The tension had reached a fever pitch, and the crowd felt it. The air was thick, crackling with the charged energy of a confrontation that had been building for months. Joy's lips tightened into a thin line, her fingers tapping the table, a silent but telling sign of her growing frustration. I'm not here to play by your rules. Joy Karoline's voice cut through the tense silence. I'm here to speak the truth, even if it makes you uncomfortable. Joy's eyebrows shot up, her eyes narrowing into sharp slits. She leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping the table in a steady, irritated rhythm. Uncomfortable! She shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Honey, I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. You don't get to lecture me on the truth. The audience murmured, some leaning forward in their seats, others exchanging quick glances, their eyes darting between the two women locked in a battle of words. Even Alyssa Farah Griffin, seated beside Joy, shifted uncomfortably, her polished, practiced poise momentarily slipping as the verbal sparring escalated. Karoline's eyes never left Joy's. She had faced down tougher critics, weathered fiercer storms, and walked through political fires that would have broken most. She wasn't about to flinch now. Oh, I'm fully aware of your tenure. Joy Karoline shot back her tone, steady, her eyes unblinking. And maybe that's the problem. You've gotten so comfortable in this echo chamber that you've forgotten what real journalism looks like. Joy's jaw tightened, the corner of her mouth twitching with barely restrained fury. The control room, filled with a dozen producers and camera operators, collectively held its breath. They had seen confrontations before, but this was different. Raw, personal, and seething with unresolved tension. Alyssa, sensing the temperature in the room rising, tried to step in, her voice smooth and diplomatic. Ladies, let's keep this civil, she said, her hands raised in a placating gesture. We're here to have a conversation, not a cage match. Karoline barely acknowledged her. She was locked in now, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, sharpening her focus. She leaned forward, her fingers curling around the edge of the table, her eyes still fixed on Joy. Civil, she echoed, a slight smile curling her lips. You want civil. How about we talk about respect? About the respect I've earned, not because of who I know, but because of what I've done. Because I stood up for my beliefs when it wasn't popular. Because I refused to be silenced. Joy leaned back slightly, her chair creaking under the sudden shift. Her eyes flicked to Alyssa, a silent plea for support. But Alyssa's gaze remained neutral, her expression carefully composed, a mask of practiced impartiality. Joy's voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. You think you're some kind of martyr, that the world is out to get you because you're some fearless truth-teller. She leaned in her face, inches from Karoline's. Spare me. You're a political puppet, a mouthpiece for a man who can't handle a little criticism without throwing a tantrum. The audience gasped, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Karoline's face remained impassive, her jaw set, eyes locked onto Joy's like a fighter waiting for the bell. And you? Karoline shot back, her voice icy and precise, are the very thing you pretend to despise. A mouthpiece for an establishment that's terrified of change, that clings to power by silencing voices like mine. Joy's eyes flashed, her fists clenching beneath the table. For a moment, the control room buzzed with nervous whispers, camera angles shifting, producers exchanging worried glances. This wasn't just a segment anymore. It was a showdown, a live, unscripted battle for the soul of political discourse. Karoline leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a steely whisper that cut through the clamor of the studio like a knife. I'm not going anywhere, Joy. And the louder you try to shout me down, the clearer my voice will become. Joy's lips parted a sharp retort forming on her tongue, but before she could speak, Karoline leaned back, her eyes never leaving Joy's, a defiant, unspoken challenge hanging in the air. The cameras kept rolling, the studio lights glaring down like the unforgiving sun in a courtroom. No one moved. No one dared breathe. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped waiting for the next volley, the next cutting remark, the next explosive clash in a war of words that had just begun. The bright studio lights blazed down on Karoline Leavitt as she straightened in her chair, her pulse steady but her mind racing. The audience around her buzzed with nervous energy, sensing that they were on the brink of something explosive. She tightened her grip on the armrests, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingers, a sharp contrast to the heat radiating from the stage. Joy Behar leaned in her glasses, perched on the edge of her nose eyes sharp behind the thin frames. So, Karoline, she began, her voice dripping with calculated calm, you really believe that just because you stand there with a smile and a well-rehearsed line, it changes the fact that your administration is built on chaos and misinformation? Karoline felt a flicker of heat rise in her chest, but she forced a smile, leaning in slightly as if sharing a secret. Chaos, she echoed, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Joy, if you want to talk about chaos, we can start with the fact that you've spent years spreading fear and division while claiming to champion unity. Isn't that a bit contradictory? A few gasps rippled through the audience, and Alyssa Farah Griffin, seated beside Joy, shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between the two women like a referee in a prize fight. She opened her mouth to cut in, but Joy held up a manicured hand, silencing her. You're deflecting? Joy shot back, her smile tight. We're talking about you, about your administration's refusal to acknowledge basic facts. Karoline's eyes sparked, her grip tightening. Basic facts. Like the kind you ignore when they don't fit your narrative. Like when you downplayed the border crisis because it didn't suit the story you wanted to tell. Or when you called concerned parents extremists just for speaking up about their children's education. The audience murmured, the energy in the room crackling like a live wire. Even the camera operators leaned in their lenses, trained tightly on the unfolding drama. Joy's jaw tightened, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. You're dodging again, Karoline. I'm talking about truth. You talk about free speech, but your side silences anyone who disagrees. Karoline leaned forward, her voice low but clear, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. No, Joy. What you're talking about is control. You want to control the narrative, control the dialogue, control who gets to speak. You're not fighting for truth. You're fighting to keep a stranglehold on the conversation. The crowd's reaction grew louder, a mix of gasps and scattered applause. Alyssa, sensing the tension spiking, finally interjected. All right, ladies, let's keep this civil. We're here to have a conversation, not a shouting match. Karoline's eyes never left Joy's, the air between them vibrating with unspoken challenge. I'm perfectly civil, she said, her voice a shade colder. But I won't sit here and let you twist reality to fit your narrative. Joy leaned back, her smile icy. Twist reality. That's rich coming from someone whose political career was born from a platform built on conspiracy theories and fear. Karoline's pulse quickened, but she kept her tone steady. Fear. You mean like the fear you and your colleagues peddle every day, convincing people that disagreement is a threat and that debate is dangerous. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the tension reached a fever pitch. Even the studio lights seemed to flicker, the shadows on the set growing sharper. Joy's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a near whisper that cut through the air like a cold wind. You're playing a dangerous game, Karoline. You might have the crowd on your side today, but you're not invincible. Karoline leaned in, her gaze locked with Joy's, unblinking. Neither are you. For a moment, the entire room held its breath, the tension so thick it felt like a physical presence. Then the director signaled for a commercial break, the red lights on the cameras blinking off, and the studio exhaled as one. Joy leaned back, exhaling slowly, her eyes still locked on Karoline. Alyssa reached for her water bottle, her hands trembling slightly. The stage hands moved quickly, adjusting microphones and checking camera angles, their movements quick and nervous, like birds sensing an approaching storm. Karoline straightened, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, sharpening her focus, heightening her senses. As the studio countdown ticked toward 0, she leaned in one last time, her voice low but steady. You wanted a fight, Joy. Be careful what you wish for. The lights flashed back on the cameras rolled and the battle continued, each woman more determined than ever to seize control of the narrative. The stakes had never been higher, and neither side was willing to back down. As the final seconds ticked away, Karoline straightened her jacket, a small, defiant smile touching her lips. She had come prepared for a fight, and she had no intention of backing down. And as the red lights blinked back on the war of words resumed sharper, louder, and more dangerous than ever.